Well, you'll recall that I think people like Dr. Wolfowitz and others back under the Bush administration in the early part of the century talked about Iraq as a Nazi state. It seems like every time we go anywhere or do anything, somebody somewhere along the line conjures up this image of Nazis, and that's absurd. It just makes no sense at all. On the other hand, what I think would be a better analogy is to point out that the Israelis want to find a particular school of fish in the ocean and then annihilate those fish. And they found out that that's almost impossible to do. And so they've concluded that the only way to get to the school of fish they want to remove is to drain the ocean. And that's what they're trying to do. Draining the ocean, however, is the path to a larger regional war. And that's where we're headed.
And we're going to talk in just a second about an article you have in the American Conservative Magazine just out today, which is a brilliant piece. I've recommended reading for everybody. In the opening part, you interview or you give a quote from Professor Omer Bartov, who we actually had on the show last week, and he said something on our show that directly relates to what you just said.
The truth is that it's not clear entirely that they can destroy Hamas militarily. I think that ultimately, if they are to remove Hamas from the Gaza Strip as the hegemon, it would not simply be a military operation. It would have to be by some kind of political international agreement. Otherwise, it can become what Lebanon became from Israel, where it ended up staying for 20 years, taking many losses, and then leaving.
You know, that's the whole thing about trying to get the fish. You can't get the fish without killing the bad fish, without killing all the fish that's in there. And if you drain the water, then all the fish get killed. But unless you're going to annihilate the population, you're not going to just get those fish, at least not by trying to just drain the water and kill everybody. And I think that's I don't think that Israel seems to be concerned about that.
Well, Professor Bartov is a very brilliant historian. He knows the historical record well. And as a result, he's acutely sensitive to the problem. The issue, though, is as follows. I think the Israelis understand those things, but I think they've decided this is the time in the history of Israel to effectively remove the Arab population from Gaza. It's very straightforward. They don't expect to successfully root out and kill all of the Hamas fighters. If they do, that's fine. I don't think they believe that they're going to be successful in extricating all of the hostages. So I think instead what they've decided to do is to make virtue of necessity and create a situation that allows them to expel the population from Gaza, because their view is that if it remains in any form, it's a permanent danger to the Israelis and a permanent thorn in the side of the Israeli Defense Force. And if you've got a very serious front to the north, which you do with Hezbollah, if you can eliminate the southern front completely, you're going to do it. And then there is also this larger issue, and this has been around for many decades, the notion of a greater Israel. The idea that everything between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean should belong to Israel. Now, a lot of people want to point to the Bible or biblical references for that, but the truth is that was a view held by many of the original Zionists, none of whom were particularly religious, let's be frank. Yeah. Many of them were atheists and Marxists and communists, so they could care less about it, but they did want to do something along those lines. And I think that one of the principal reasons that Mr. Netanyahu has decided to do it is this is late in his life. This is, I think, a dream he's had for a long time. He knows he has the support of the Israeli population because they're horrified and shocked by what happened on the 7th of October.
Yeah.
And so he has a degree of support there that he may never have again. And then on top of that, you have the United States. And right now, Mr. Netanyahu speaks with greater authority in Washington, D.C. than President Joe Biden.
And here's how Netanyahu is using that authority.
All Hamas operatives and terrorists must die. Our forces are acting above and beneath the ground, targeting them. We are going to continue full force. We are going to continue until victory. We are also very well prepared in the north. Aggressive fire from the air and from the ground over there. And I have warned Hezbollah, don't make that mistake and enter the war.
So it does pretty much sound like he's using your drain the ocean to go get after those fish mentality. And you addressed this in today's American Conservative magazine. In this article, it was entitled Israel's War of Decision. And one of the most interesting quotes I found out of that was, you wrote, "The question for Israelis and the Americans that support them is whether Israel's desired end state is an Arab-free state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. If the answer is yes, then the Middle East is indeed on a path to a war of decision, a war that will govern Israel's continued existence and the future extent of America's strategic influence in the Near East and North Africa." So in writing that, when you say this war of decision, are you referring to specifically just within the Gaza Strip, or is this something much larger in the region?
Well, I think it's much larger, frankly. The other thing is Clausewitz talked about two different kinds of wars. He talked about wars of observation, which we would call low-intensity conflict, frankly, the outcome of which is not terribly important to the main player, in our case, the United States. And we treated lesser contingencies in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere as, well, if we're successful, we're successful. If we're not, we go home. The wars of decision involve the existence of the state itself. And I think Mr. Netanyahu has been very clear that as far as he's concerned, the fight in Gaza is an existential one for Israel, that Gaza is the beginning of a decisive outcome that will secure Israel, he hopes, in perpetuity. My fear is that having turned this into a war of decision, he's going to end up in a regional conflict that we cannot help them win. We can try, but I think ultimately they will lose, because for the first time in 1,000 years, you have the Islamic world, certainly in North Africa and the Middle East, and probably including Asia, is actually quite united in their opposition to what Israel is doing. And the region has changed. 50 years ago, when we had the October 73 war, you could compartmentalize the fight. You could fight the Egyptians on one side, the Syrians on the other, without worrying about others in the region intervening. Today, the entire region is inflamed. The entire region is prepared to intervene in one way or another. And it's no longer just Arabs. Now we're talking not just about Iran, but also
right.
And I think that to press ahead, which I expect is what they will do, I think once this temporary pause is over, that they will go back to doing what they did. They will move south to Khan Yunis, and they will treat Khan Yunis and southern Gaza exactly the way they did northern Gaza. And they will drive more people out. And as this develops and becomes obvious, it will be much harder for the entire region not to become engaged.
Right. And that actually is one of my biggest concerns, because the casualties up to this point have been somewhere around 15,000, depending on who you want to believe. Whatever the number is, it's huge among the Palestinians. And that's causing even many in the United States, many of the former aides of several prominent Democratic senators, they're actually trying to press for them to move more in the direction of ceasefire and trying to find a negotiated settlement. And if the Israeli Defense Forces move further into the south, where the population density is now double what it was in the north, then those numbers could actually skyrocket. And then you have the real risk of losing support at home. And then perhaps, and I don't know whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's Turkey, or even somebody right now who doesn't even want to come into the fight. It seems like the pressure will be much greater on the Arabs to do something.
Well, very recently, there was a cabinet meeting, and in the cabinet meeting, everyone but Netanyahu wanted to go ahead and attack Hezbollah. And he very prudently intervened and said, no, we don't want to bring Hezbollah into this war. The problem is what we've just discussed, what you just outlined, will bring Hezbollah into the war. And it's not just Hezbollah. Again, we could talk about this, but you've listened to the statements by Mr. Erdogan. And there's a very dangerous predisposition, both in Israel and Europe and the United States, not to take President Erdogan seriously.
Yes.
It's a serious mistake in my judgment. And he said a number of things. I mean, he spoke publicly and he said, Mr. Netanyahu is no longer a strategic partner with whom we are prepared to discuss anything. He's a war criminal. He leads a war criminal state called Israel. No more negotiations with those people. And then secondly, he went on to say at some point Turkish soldiers would fight in Gaza, But in my judgment, even more important, he said, you've used nuclear weapons to threaten people in the past in the region. Your nuclear weapons will not save you, Mr. Netanyahu, no matter how many you think you have. I think he knows that he can get control of nuclear warheads and weapons from Pakistan. And that's the great fear in Israel has not been that others would gain control of nuclear weapons and use them. It is that if they gain control of a nuclear weapon, they would be able to deter the Israelis from using theirs.
Which,
that's exactly where I think Mr. Erdogan is headed. Now we have this flotilla. You haven't talked about that. We should a little bit. This flotilla of over 1,000 ships carrying humanitarian assistance, which is supposed to put to sea today. It may already have. I don't know. It would arrive then, I would suspect, Friday or Saturday. And one wonders how that will be greeted by the Israelis.
Yeah, that is a potential real flashpoint. And I think some intend it to be a flashpoint.
Mm-hmm.
So here's the real question, Doug, because all the things you lay out there and the risks of escalation, therefore the risk to the U.S. interest in the region, what can the Biden administration do right now? Because they're under a lot of pressure, double pressure on the one side to have a ceasefire, to do something, and on the other hand, to just stay completely pro-Israel and whatever they say, keep doing. So with those kind of pressures on him, knowing what this could lead to, what should the United States do right now?
Well, I think the United States, if it had real leadership, would intervene and simply say, if you continue on the current path, we will withdraw our forces. In other words, we will not support you. What we want is a ceasefire. I don't care whether or not it suits your interests, but if you're going to pursue this strategy of mass expulsion and potentially murder, then we can't support you. And I think it's pretty clear. You and I are part of a generation of Americans who grew up in an environment where we were acutely sensitive to the Jewish Holocaust of the Second World War.
Right.
And many of us, I know this was strong with me and my family, felt that 6 million Jews had been the down payment on the state of Israel, and that we had an interest, a moral interest in helping Israel survive. We were not going to allow it to be destroyed, right, the population murdered, enslaved, driven into the sea. That's not true with the people that have followed us, Dan. The generation that's coming up does not feel that way as we once did. And it becomes increasingly difficult to persuade them to feel that way when they see the Israelis, frankly, right, behaving the way they have towards the Arabs. And let's be frank, not every Israeli thinks the Arabs are subhuman, but they very definitely are frequently viewed that way and treated that way. And the Arabs have had it. They're not going to put up with it any longer. And they have the numbers. But also, again, there are now people who are not Arabs, the Turks in particular, and the Iranians, who are willing to help. And behind them stand the Russians, and more distantly, the Chinese. Their interests are a little different. In other words, the Chinese don't want the Straits of Hormuz to be closed.
Right.
They're dependent upon the oil and the gas. They want to do business with the Iranians. They're trying to build this Belt and Road. The Russians, they're looking at it from the standpoint of the Americans, constitute in their mind a lunatic state, that wherever we go, we cause misery and destruction.
Certainly for them, yeah.
And so the Russian view is that we can't let them do that to the region, to the Middle East. I mean, some of your viewers will remember when Syria was being destroyed in the Civil War, Putin said, what has to happen to satisfy America? Does every single building and every single Syrian have to die? Does everything have to be destroyed to satisfy American strategic interests? Remember, we were supporting people that you and I, on any normal day, would have shot without hesitation, right, ISIS-like characters. We were supporting them against Mr. Assad. And this was in part because the Israelis insisted that Assad was bad. But the truth is, there were many people in Israel and many in the West that said, well, you may not like Assad, but he maintains a degree of stability over there, which is useful. I remember Edward Luttwak, who was shocked when the Israelis and the Americans demanded that Assad withdraw all the Syrian forces from Lebanon. He said, don't you understand what you're doing? You pull those forces out, who will keep order? Who will keep a lid on the chaos? Well, nobody cared. And the Syrian civil war erupted, and God knows how many people have died over there and how terrible it's been, certainly on the scale of the Spanish Civil War. So I think the Russians are taking the position, if we have to support Turkey and if we have to support Iran in the event that we, the Americans, unwittingly follow the Israeli lead and widen this region, then we will do so. They have to be stopped.
Yeah, and that's what worries me. This thing could really just blow out of hand. I think too many people, Doug, believe what you said, that whether it's Erdogan or Hezbollah or Iran, they're going to be deterred. Ultimately, Israel can do whatever it wants, and this will go back to some kind of pacifist issue, and we'll just get it off the front legs. And I think that's a bad gamble, not just even a hope to base your policies on, which it seems we're doing. Unfortunately, that's not the only bad place I think where we have some problematic policy towards our own interest, and that is in the Russia-Ukraine war. And in the remainder of the time we have here, I want to jump over to that because, well, I think we have some bad precedents of where we're even going right now. And we had the Secretary of State the other day said, in this circumstance that after this failed offensive, after Ukraine has almost utilized all of their manpower, now they're going down to 18-year-old kids, after they have lost, so much of the armored vehicles, and they don't even, now they're running low on air defense missiles, and we're running low on the ability to restock it. And in light of all that, you have Secretary of State saying this.
To put Ukraine on a solid foundation for the next year, we must help Ukraine do 4 things at once. First, keep fighting to win back its territory. Second, build a world-class military force to ensure maximum deterrence for the long term and make clear to President Putin that he cannot and will not outlast Ukraine, and he cannot and will not outlast all of Ukraine's supporters. Third, kickstart economic recovery and growth and bring more hope, more opportunity to the Ukrainian people. And fourth, accelerate the reform process to speed Ukraine's path to the European Union and to attract investment.
Doug, this is, I have to give my wife credit on this one. Francis the other day said, this sounds something more like the unicorn strategy. It would be great if this was the truth, and yet he's actually pinning us to that, but there's no foundation for it, is there?
Well, actually, I thought he was going to mention to put Ukrainian astronauts on the moon in the near future. I mean, it's about as ridiculous. It's absurd. It's insane. It has no chance of happening. And Russians are capturing 70-year-old men. The Russians are capturing 13, 14, 15-year-old boys. The Russians are now finding women dead on the battlefield.
Yeah,
this is insane. This war is lost. Now, there's a battle happening in Avdiivka right now, as you know. That's turning into a bloodbath for the Ukrainians, but it's also turned into a rough fight for the Russians because many of the fortifications the Russians are attacking were built over many years. So it has not been an easy nut to crack. But it's going to turn out badly for Ukraine. And the question is, will any of these general officers in the Ukrainian army step forward and say, that's it, enough's enough? And someone asked me the other day, do you think there are any Ukrainian patriots in uniform that will do that? And I said, I don't know. It's incomprehensible to me because Ukraine never had a chance to win this thing. And the notion of building a world-class military, it takes decades to build that sort of force.
You literally wrote the book on that one. Several of them, actually.
So anyhow, he's a fool, and he's making fools out of us, and he's helping to sacrifice millions of lives for nothing.
Now, what is the risk here for the United States if we keep saying, yeah, well, I mean, eventually we're going to give them some money. We're going to have a show on tomorrow where Senator Rand Paul tells us flatly he's not giving another dollar to Ukraine because he said there's no American interest in it, and he listed a bunch of other reasons, but he's not the only one. So it's not at all clear that there's going to be more money, or if it is, it's probably going to be a lot less than what anybody's hoping, but it's in no way going to be enough to turn the tide at any point in the foreseeable future, not the least of which because they won't have the manpower to use that if they get it. That being the case, where is this war going to go? Can it stay a stalemate like many in Washington want, or is there a risk that at some point the Ukraine army buckles?
Well, I think the Ukrainian army is buckling. That's happening. There's no question about it. The issue is on the Russian side. The Russians have the initiative now, Dan. And today, Putin made a statement. I say today, I received it this morning. It may have happened yesterday. I don't know. In which he said that there was no point in talking to Washington until after the election. So the Russians have written off the Biden administration, have no intention of holding discussions or talks with them at all. So I think the Russians are looking to Europe, wondering whether or not someone with character and intelligence will emerge in Berlin or Paris or somewhere else to step forward and say, we're going to take ownership of this disaster. We're going to help stop it and chart a path to peace. I don't think that's going to happen. I just don't. I wish it would, but we're a long way from that. I think we're going to have to see some changes in the governments, and the Europeans have been very slow to do that. Now, what does that mean? I think the Russians are going to hold what they have. They have, I'm told, already put together a series of terms, and I think they're going to want to control everything from Odessa to Kharkov. And you're going to have this historic area that was called New Russia fundamentally under their control. Now, people say, well, that's unacceptable. We're not going to accept that. That's fine. Then the Russians are going to say, then we'll continue.
I'm not asking your question, permission.
Yeah, we're going to move further west. And I think they will. They'll move slowly. There's an example of this. In 1918, the Bolsheviks sat down with the Imperial General Staff of the German Army and said, we're willing to do this or that or the next thing. And the Germans said, listen, we don't care, what you want to do. This is a line. It was called Brest-Litovsk. We're drawing this line. Yeah. And that's where we're going to draw the line with your current state called the Soviet Union. Bolsheviks said, well, we don't care. We're not going to go along with this. Well, next thing that happened was that General Max Hoffman got on the phone, called up and said, they don't want to do business. So 400,000 German troops began moving towards Moscow. Well, within 24 hours, Lenin said, sign anything they ask you to. End this. We won't survive this. And he was right. And I think something like that will eventually happen with the Ukrainians because the Russians are going to do what the Germans did. The difference, of course, is the Russians aren't fighting on a second or third front against other enemies. They've only got one front. That front's in Ukraine. They can manage that very effectively. And so they're going to get whatever they want, whether we like it or not. We should be interested in the humanitarian dimension. We don't seem to be interested in that. They don't need any more weapons. They don't need any more bullets. They need an end to this disaster so that we can rescue what's left of the Ukrainian nation. And I don't know how much is left, Dan.
You see, and that's my just anguishing frustration is that fundamentally, as we talk about literally every time we get on the air here, or you and I talk on the phone or whatever, it is clear there is no military fundamental that should give anyone any kind of rational hope that Ukraine could win the war on the battlefield. There's none, not even a little bit. Therefore, at the end of this is already ordained. And Russia clearly appears willing to pay a large price for it, both in manpower and personnel and equipment and everything else. But they have it, and they're going to pay it. That should be now clear to everyone. The difference is that if a negotiation was made today, whether Biden said, hey, Zelensky, we're going to give you about a third of what you're asking for, and there ain't any more coming, you need to negotiate. Or if Zelensky on his own came to that conclusion and recognized they could make a negotiation and probably get most of what they currently have right now. But if they don't, if they continue bullheadedly saying, no, we're going to try to go against reality, then I think what you described is probably the most likely outcome, which is that they could lose substantially more territory, and then they'll be given terms. They won't even get to negotiate. That's my worry, that thousands more people could die for no reason to their own country.
Well, you know that no one in Washington is going to stand up and admit that they were wrong about anything.
Yeah, we do have precedent with
the administration. All the underlying assumptions were wrong. Russia is weak. No, Russia's not weak. If we put enough pressure on the Russians, they'll overthrow this man, Putin. Nonsense. He's stronger now than he's ever been. The Russian economy is performing brilliantly, much better than our Western economies.
It's amazing.
And the Russian military that began this process was always too small for the kind of war that presented itself to the Russians. But again, remember, the Russians didn't expect us to react the way we did. They actually thought we were going to negotiate with them and wanted to avoid a war. When they finally figured out that wasn't the case, it took them 6 to 7 months to build up their force. Today, they're more powerful and more capable than they have been since the 1980s. It's an excellent force. Yeah. But again, they don't want to invade Eastern Europe. This is the big myth.
Right.
I was just on talking to some Germans, and they pointed out that the German defense minister says, we Germans now have to prepare for war. So we're going to have to spend lots of money to rebuild the old army. And I said, well, first of all, you don't want the old army because that's the wrong answer for the future. But secondly, where's the evidence? I mean, if the Russians wanted to march west, they'd already be doing it. And they're not doing it. They don't want to march west. They want to return to some degree of normalcy to do business. We are the ones that are preventing it. And we're telling Zelensky, well, we would like you to take ownership of the disaster. I'm sure Zelensky says, well, listen, you told me that you would guarantee victory. And now you want me to stand up and take the blame for everything that's wrong when everything that's happened is because of you. Ultimately, I think he'll board a plane and fly somewhere if he survives. And as I've said before to other people, I think he'll end up with an ice pick in his skull at some point anyway. But in the meantime, what happens to the Ukrainian people? Nobody seems to give a damn about that.
I know.
I don't understand it. It's incomprehensible to me.
Yeah, this idea that no, we care about free and all this, and we're going to help them win. That's an aspiration. That's a unicorn. If we could just do what we want to do, no matter what the realities, it would be cool. But the realities are there. There's no unicorn, and you're condemning people to die in pursuit of something that's militarily unattainable. And that is, I just still can't get my head wrapped around that, because there should be more people that understand what you have been talking about. But I don't know if they don't know, or if they don't care, which might be worse than not knowing. But either way, it's bad for Ukraine. It's bad for the United States. Well, we're going to have to leave it there for right now, Doug. There's so much more we can talk about. And unfortunately, neither one of these topics are going away anytime soon. We're going to continue asking you to come on and, share with us what the U.S. could do in each of these phases as we get further in, to try and cut off the bleeding.
Well, give my best to Senator Rand Paul. And remember, he's one of the few voices of sanity on the Hill who from the very beginning warned against all this. He's in the position of having been right. No one's going to give him credit for it in the Senate, obviously, because they're all warmongers, and they're all on the payroll of various warmongers. That's the problem in Washington. Washington is, to paraphrase Ralph Nader, used to say it's corporate occupied territory. I call it donor occupied territory now. We have our oligarchs that have bought up various members of the House and the Senate. That's why we do the things we do. Americans need to wake up and understand that. But Rand Paul is the great exception, deserves credit for that. No, I don't see any truth in it. And I think he's trying desperately to do whatever he can to drag us back into the war, because he knows that he's effectively on the road to being abandoned. He knows the money is going to stop. The arms have already stopped. The ammunition isn't coming. He's at the end of his rope. So I think he's probably ready to do or say anything that promises to help him in any way.
Yeah. Okay. So by following your work and your contacts, we've learned the truth that millions, tens of millions of Ukrainians have fled Ukraine. They have no plan of returning to the country. 500,000 plus Ukrainian soldiers have been killed or injured. Yet the war continues, with Zelensky remaining confident that he can win. Is this Zelensky employing his acting skills, or does he actually believe he can beat Russia and Vladimir Putin?
No, I think he's more sober-minded than that. He's at the end, and he's going to say whatever he can to prop himself up to the bitter end. Who knows what sort of fate awaits him? I think there's a darn good chance that he may not survive in office. He's offended, aggravated, angered millions of Ukrainians. He's led them down the path to total disaster. That usually ends badly for the leader. And then, of course, he's probably got a number of escape routes planned to various places where his bank accounts and homes are located. But, look, this war is over. If you wanted any evidence for that, all you had to do was essentially look at the budget fight over the money. Suddenly now everyone who was pushing war with Russia in Ukraine is now pushing war with the world inside Gaza for Israel. So we've just essentially taken the same chorus, moved it to a different theater. They're singing the same kinds of tunes, hoping for a better outcome. I don't think the outcome is going to be good in either case, but that's another matter.
Do you think, or what would you guess, NATO leaders are telling Zelensky behind the scenes? Do you think that they're saying, "Hey, listen, we've supported you, we've given you more than enough. it didn't work out and it's now time to get to the peace talk tables? Or do you think that they are still quietly behind the scenes pumping him up with confidence that he can win this thing?
I think he's probably being told privately that it's over and that he should probably step down graciously, which I don't think he can do, as I mentioned earlier, in favor of someone else stepping forward that the West can present as a credible representative of the remaining Ukrainian state, whatever that is, to sit down and negotiate some sort of end to the conflict with the Russians. I think any thoughts of turning Ukraine into the contemporary equivalent of Napoleon's Spanish ulcer for Russia are over. I don't think anybody thinks that that's possible. I also don't see much evidence that anybody in Europe wants that to happen. So, we'll just have to watch. Now, I do see evidence that you still have some fighting. The Ukrainians are sort of clinging with their fingernails to the edge of the cliff. And the Russians are now pressing ahead. Anybody who thinks that the Russians are sitting still is wrong. This Avdiivka fight, which is sort of Bakhmut on steroids, I think is about over. After that, I'm not sure there's much left. Whatever Ukrainians are there that still constitute the army will want to retire to the Dnieper River and cross it and get out of the way. The question is entirely up to the Russians. What do they want to do? What are they going to demand? Are they going to offer any terms at all? To whom will they speak? They're certainly not going to pay any attention to anything we say. We've yet to tell the truth to them about anything. So the question is, who can step forward? I don't have that answer. I think they've got to wait, frankly, until there's some turnover in European governments and they have new leadership before they can expect anything from them. So, the tragedy is not yet completely over, but for all intents and purposes, this is the end. In other words, this is similar to the situation that existed after we crossed the Rhine and the Soviets reached the outskirts of Berlin.
Okay. Well, Zelensky has also said that Putin is taking every opportunity to undermine Ukrainian democracy and elections. But isn't it Zelensky that's not allowing elections in order to keep himself in power?
Well, what do you want? I mean, the man's already said that there will be no elections in Ukraine for the foreseeable future. He's effectively banned the Orthodox Christian Church from operating in Ukraine. I mean, just go down the Bill of Rights. Who has any rights left? I'm not sure there are many rights that cannot be discarded with impunity by him. He still has a substantial SBU, or Ukrainian secret police, behind him, which looks more and more like the NKVD under Stalin, rounding up people, forcing them into uniform or disappearing them, if you will. I wonder what's going to happen to this Gonzaga Lira, who is sitting in a Ukrainian jail because he was honest and told the truth about events on the ground in Ukraine. Apparently, he's simply being left to rot in prison. The State Department doesn't seem to be interested in the man, even though he's an American citizen. It's a very tragic situation. But, that's a good warning for everybody, including people like me, what you can expect from this administration if you're in trouble.
Yeah, probably because Gonzalo Lira was not beating the drum that Washington, D.C. wanted. And so they're like, we're not going to back a journalist who isn't putting out the narrative that we demand, as if he was Twitter or Facebook or Google or something like that.
Yeah.
Do you think that in the last couple of days there's been multiple drone attacks on the capital of Ukraine? Do you think that Putin and the Russian Federation army, have they been attacking the capital this whole time and it's just now coming into the news? Or is this something new as they try to get people to the peace talk tables? What do you think is going on there?
Well, they've launched attacks at targets that they could identify as having some military value or political military value. It's been episodic, but I think they're very definitely ratcheting up the pressure because, the Ukrainian forces are now actually defecting in large numbers. We've always had numbers of Ukrainian commanders that surrendered smaller units because they couldn't evacuate their wounded. They didn't want the wounded to die, and they knew that the Russians would provide them with better care. I mean, one of the problems inside the Ukrainian military from day one has been a very inadequate structure for medical treatment and evacuation. So that that much is persistent. I think they're ratcheting up the pressure because they're going to close in on Kiev. They're going to roll up to the Dnieper River. There's no question about it. Frankly, there's not a whole lot out there to stop them. And I think they have hoped that someone would sober up in the West and step forward and say, let's talk, enough's enough, you've won, let's see what your terms are. But no one's done that. And until somebody does, there is no incentive for Russian forces on the ground to stop.
But from everything you've seen, is this, NATO's been telling us, you watch, they'll go for the capital next, then they'll roll into Poland and Eastern Europe, or is this just the natural consequence of war that, hey, in order to get someone to surrender, you go for the flag, you go for the capital?
Again, I think that is probably on everybody's mind right now in Moscow. But having said that, we've got to keep a certain number of things clear in our minds. First of all, when the Russians initially intervened, everyone said, oh, look at this pitiful force. It's too small for the mission. There aren't enough Russian troops. They don't know what they're doing. Well, they were half right. Putin had never intended to invade and strike all the way to the Dnieper River. I was one of those who was surprised, because I thought that the Russians would behave as historically they've done when it became clear they had no alternative. They would drive hell-bent for election deep into Ukrainian territory to try and rapidly encircle and destroy what was there. That didn't happen because I don't think Putin accurately calculated the response he was going to get from the West. I think he was surprised at the enormous hostility and hatred that emitted from Washington, D.C. and other European capitals. So now they've got the force available that could take them all the way to the Polish border without question. But again, it's not really what he wants. The Russians don't want to rule the Ukrainians in the West. They know the Ukrainians in the West are true Ukrainians. These people have never lost their sense of identity or their cultural foundation, their language. They are different from the Russians. The Russians don't want to be burdened with that. Everybody thinks, well, they want to restore the Warsaw Pact. Why? The Warsaw Pact was no great benefit by the time the thing fell apart to the Russians. Cuba is another example. It was a disaster, just an open black pit for Russian money and resources. So he doesn't want to do that. Everything is a function of, well, who's going to step forward and who's going to take ownership, who's going to admit the war is over. That hasn't sorted itself out in the West yet. So between now and Christmas, I would suspect that he'll simply press to the Dnieper River. And that's a natural dividing line. That line will be seized. Then the next question is, who's going to negotiate an end to it? And if nobody comes forward and nobody's left, well, then you can cross the river and go into Kiev and decide what you want there for a government. The Russians will not accept a rump Ukraine as a member of NATO. Off the table. It's impossible. The Russians will not accept a government in Kiev that is incurably hostile to Russia. Why would they? In other words, no more platforms for attack against Russia. What they wanted was an Austrianized Ukraine, some sort of state that would be friendly with, but not necessarily hostile to Russia. In other words, it would not be part of a hostile alliance. I think they're going to get it, but we're not there yet. We'll just have to wait and see what it develops in Europe. In Washington, nothing will happen. I don't know if people realize it, but just take one look at Washington, D.C. It's paralyzed. It's paralyzed with a mix of arrogance, ignorance, and stupidity, in my judgment. They have failed consistently in every single important category of foreign and defense policy. The defense establishment is in ruins. We can't recruit for an army that can fight. We don't have the resources to send anywhere. We don't have any additional ammunition left. We have to replenish our own stocks. We have open borders. Millions of people have poured into the country. We don't know who they are, but they're increasingly an enormous economic burden. We have a failing economy and a deteriorating financial situation. Despite what you hear on the mainstream media, everybody says everything's great. Oh, there's a bull market. Well, let's all get in there. Forget it. Only a fool would do a thing like that. I remind people that in June of 1929, Secretary of the Treasury Mellon told the American people, "We live in an era of unbroken prosperity. There is nothing to fear." Meanwhile, he was liquidating all of his own stock holdings, investing heavily in gold and cash. And he wasn't the Lone Ranger. People lie. And the bunch in Washington is standing on a mountain of lies. Now they've taken this Israeli problem on, and they've done the worst possible thing. Instead of sitting down and saying to the Israelis, look, we're not in a position to fight a major regional war. We cannot promise you unconditional support. You're going to have to limit the scope of your operations. That may change in the future, but today, these are the limits. Nobody said that. We're back to what we told Zelensky. You have the scientific, industrial, military power of the United States and NATO behind you. You are going to win. We will give you everything. Well, I think that's what Mr. Netanyahu is also counting on. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, wow. We can barely do one war, let alone two, and yet they tell the American people, we're America. Of course we could do two. Yeah, bring on China while you're at it. My gosh.
Yes. It's just monumentally stupid.
Yeah. So just a couple of days ago, I had General Michael Flynn on my show. He said one of the things he was investigating before the deep state made their move to remove him from the Trump cabinet, that there was an awful lot of money laundering happening from the Pentagon through military operations. The day before I interviewed him, the Pentagon failed an audit saying, we can't account for $3 trillion. $3 trillion is the amount of money that they bring in tax collections from every American combined. So do you think there's any truth to what General Flynn is saying, or is it just hard to track money and weapons when you're in the heat of war?
Well, that's a great excuse. The next time I plan to go to war, I could forget about stealing money and plussing up my bank account. I don't know the details. I'm sure he would not say such a thing if it were not true. So I impute credibility to his statement. I think he's on to something. But look.
And now a quick message from today's video sponsor, Morgan & Morgan. In 2020, there were over 5 million auto accidents. That's more than 600 an hour. 600 an hour. And those in an accident may be entitled to more than they think. A few years ago, I was injured in an auto accident. At first, I didn't want to hire a lawyer because I felt bad for the woman that hit me. But I learned from the law firm that they would be going after the insurance company to make me whole and not the woman. Morgan & Morgan have modernized the injury law process so you can submit a claim and communicate with your legal team all over the phone. So if you're ever injured in an auto accident, you can check out Morgan & Morgan. You can submit a claim in 8 clicks or less without having to leave your couch. For more information, go to forthepeople.com/Stephen Gardner or dial #law. That's pound 529 from your cell phone. All right, let's get back to today's news update.
No one in Washington is interested in a real audit of anything. We can't audit the Fed. I think you'd have trouble auditing a lot of the senators in their personal finances as well as in the public ones. I think the entire structure of our government has fallen apart. People don't realize how fragile our government is at this point. The rest of the world looks at us and they see the old American brand. Oh, America is powerful. There's no one that can challenge the United States. Its military is all powerful. It's this, that, and everything. Those days are over. That's 30 years ago. That's 1991. Today, everything has changed. We've had enormous demographic changes. We have enormous discontent inside our country with a whole range of people for very, very serious reasons. We don't have societal cohesion anymore. Go back and look at the days of Gulf War I. Look at the attitudes that people held at that point and how people reacted to what was happening, and then look what's going on now. The point I'm trying to make, and I've said this several times, the last thing the United States needs at this point in our history is a war of any kind. We have too much to do here at home. We're already spending $1 trillion plus every year now to service our enormous sovereign debt. You know, normally your creditors, and we have creditors, will come to you and say, look, it's obvious your head's underwater. You've got to cut spending. If you cut spending, we'll restructure your debt to enable you to pay it. That's what you do. That's what Franklin Roosevelt did in 32 and 34. He didn't call it a default. They called it restructuring the debt. Can we do that now? It's probably too late. Who holds most of the debt, internally and externally? Well, that's another lengthy explanation, but let's be frank. The Saudis, the Chinese, the Japanese, the British, other Europeans, they hold most of the debt. Do they ever really expect to be paid back? I think they've reached a point now where they see no evidence that we will ever cut spending. So where are we headed? Steve, we're headed over the cliff. In fact, some people say we've already gone over, and it's only a matter of time until we hit the bottom. When you hit the bottom, that's when everything will change. But until then, people are going to keep doing what they've always done because they've gotten away with it. So I think General Flynn is right. And I think it's the tip of the proverbial iceberg.
Yeah. Wow. Oof. Oh, some of this stuff gives me nightmares to read about.
Well, the bad news is that most Americans are still not paying a great deal of attention. Most Americans think things can be handled, or, you know, the government will fix it. I mean, my generation is in receipt of, you know, their retirement checks, pension funds, whatever savings they have. They're all settling in for a comfortable retirement. And I've tried to tell them what happens if the checks stop. What do people do when the food stamps stop? Oh, well, that will never happen. Gee, have we ever heard that before? That will never happen. I mean, Billy Mitchell predicted that the Japanese were the most likely candidate to bomb Pearl Harbor. He made that prediction originally in 1922. It was repeated subsequently. And people at times said, oh, well, that's ridiculous. Why would they ever do that? Well, we're in the same position now. We've grossly underestimated everything, and we're underestimating the Middle East. And this is the real danger that we confront there. It's similar to what we did in Eastern Europe with the Russians. We underestimated the Russians. We decided they were weak and that we were far stronger than we are. We said their society would fragment. Ours is the one in trouble, not theirs. We said their economy would falter, but it's our economy that's in trouble, not theirs. I mean, we just go down the list. So I think we're doing something similar now in the Middle East, and I think it comes at great cost to Israel.
Yeah. But before we jump in there, I want to ask you something. This may be a little silly, but it's a big story in the news today. There's a retired colonel. I don't know if you know him or not. His name is Colonel Carl Nell. He came out today and said that the United States government, the CIA, and secret UFO programs need to come clean by 2030 and share their secret knowledge with each other in order to give the United States an advantage over the rest of the world before it's too late. Any idea who this guy is? Why is a retired colonel coming out and making it sound as if these different entities are all hiding UFO technology that would benefit the United States?
I really don't know.
You don't know him?
No,
Okay.
I assume he's an Air Force officer, but he could be an Army officer. I have no knowledge whatsoever of him. And by the way, you know, the entire discussion of aliens is very obtuse. I mean, I've seen plenty of evidence to suggest it's quite real. I've seen plenty of evidence to suggest it's absolutely nonsense. I am not in a position to judge any of it. So I don't know, but I've learned that a lot of things are probably true that we don't know. And so at some point the truth will come out. Look, we're still arguing over the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot that we don't know. And I think once this government implodes, and I think it will, I think it's headed to rock bottom, we may discover some things. We may find out some things. But until it does, everything that you just mentioned is pure speculation.
Yeah. Okay. It was on the front page of the Daily Mail. You're a colonel. He's a colonel. I thought I would just throw it out there. Okay.
So we're not all electronically linked, you know.
Yeah. Okay. Couple of questions, and then I know you have to get off. Since the October attack on Israel, the U.S. military has had an increase in attacks in Iraq and Syria. Do you think as the Israel-Gaza situation continues that the United States military bases and units will become increasingly under threat around the world?
Well, I don't know about around the world, but very definitely inside the Islamic world. When I was in the building and before I went into the building and I first interviewed with the president for another position, I warned about the situation in Turkey. I felt strongly that we should get our forces out of there. If you go back to 2003, you will remember that the Turks denied us access to moving our forces through Turkey into Iraq. And everyone was shocked. But nobody knows the truth or the historical record. When we first went in to Iraq, the Turks were apoplectic. They were apoplectic because the Turks, of course, regard the Iranians as a rival. They saw Saddam Hussein, for a whole range of reasons, as essentially a bulwark against Iran. They didn't want us to go in there and destabilize the country. And they knew, because Iraq is another artificial construct. It's not a real country in the sense that we think of ourselves in Europe as nations. You could argue that we in the West, in the United States, are an artificial construct in many ways. We weren't always that way, but increasingly it looks that way. But that's not true in the Middle East. Iraq was drawn up along with Jordan and a number of other countries at the Versailles Peace Conference. So they said, look, he may not be perfect, but the country is stable. We can do business with it. We can live with it. And he's focused primarily or disproportionately on Iran. We ignored it. We went back in 2003 and did more damage. We created the Kurdish monster in many respects that now threatens or has been threatening Turkey for some time, despite Mr. Erdogan's best efforts to try and tame that. So the Turks look at us and say, you're nothing but trouble. You've caused us unending heartache. Same thing is true in most of the Arab countries. But I think we need to understand that. And Americans, they don't. You know, we're back to this. So the Americans wear the white hats. We're the good guys. We come in, peace, love, and harmony burst out from every direction. No, it's not the case. So we need to get those troops out. Donald Trump wanted to get them out when I was there in November and December and early January. He wanted them out of Iraq. He wanted them out of Syria. He was obstructed. He was obstructed by his own party on the Hill. He was obstructed by numerous lobbies because the argument was, well, we have to stay there because of the Iranian threat. Well, the Iranian threat was already in Iraq. The Iranians have been running the show there almost from November of 2003 until the present. We could never have had any modicum of stability in that country if the Iranians hadn't intervened with the Shiites in the south so that we could deal with the Sunnis in the middle by either buying them off with cash or killing them. So the whole thing has been a facade of stability that was never there. We need to get out. Syria is another one. And our positions in these countries are, by any stretch of the imagination, illegal. The Iraqi parliament voted us out back in 2020, said, get out, leave our country. So much for our respect for democracy. We said, oh, sorry, can't do that. We're staying. Syria is another case. We are there illegally. There's nothing there that justifies our presence or control of this tiny oil spot that's up in the northeast of the country. And now we are viewed as unwanted aliens and potentially threatening, not just to the Iranians and the Iranian proxy of militias, but by the Sunnis and the Turks. So we need to get out, but we won't get out. will stay, and things are going to get a lot worse. And it's going to be very difficult to rescue them. A friend of mine in the building gave me a good comparison. It's a bad thought, but it worries me a great deal. Most of your viewers will not remember World War II and Wake Island. Wake Island was this tiny island out in the vast Pacific. It was important to us for many reasons strategically, but it was indefensible. It was too small, couldn't possibly be defended. We wanted to get troops out, but we couldn't. So the Marines that were on Wake were lost. They were captured and went away. The same thing was true in the Philippines. We tried to get out of the Philippines through most of the 1930s. FDR actually empowered MacArthur with the president of the Philippines to make a deal for neutrality for the Philippines so that we could avoid a war with the Japanese in the event that they decided to seize the Philippines. All of these things failed. So we had 11,000 American soldiers captured on Bataan. We had 1,000 plus Marines and sailors captured on Wake Island. We have a history of this. This is not good. And once the enemy holds your soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, what are you left to do? What's your answer? Global war, total war, world war? Why wait for the inevitable to occur? So I think we should get out of all of these places, but I hold the minority opinion.
Yeah. Oof. Okay, just a couple more questions, then we'll get you out. I appreciate your time. Saudi Arabia has called for an end to the carnage happening in Gaza. Prince Mohammed bin Salman has said if Israel doesn't stop these illegal attacks on Palestine and Gaza, that he will wake up the Middle East against Israel. Is this a credible threat? What are your thoughts on his comments?
I think they've already begun the wake-up call. So I think he's absolutely serious. Now, the Saudis and the Emirates, Egypt in particular, several other North African countries, they have a weapon at their disposal in terms of oil and gas. In the case of Saudi Arabia, it has the weapon known as the U.S. Treasuries. If it simply dumps all of the treasuries it holds, that could start a fire sale here because our banks hold vast quantities of these treasuries that were bought when the interest rates were very, very low that now have really no value. If those things begin, that's going to have a huge impact here. But from a military standpoint, the one actor in the region that should be taken very seriously is Mr. Erdogan in Turkey. And I wish people would look at the remarks that he's made over the last couple of weeks. And he said several things that everyone should listen to this man. He is not hot air. He's real. He leads the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East. He leads it in North America. He is a believer. He is quite serious. And he said recently, speaking directly to Netanyahu, you, Mr. Netanyahu, are finished. You're gone. We are not talking to you anymore. It's over. Then he said, you, Mr. Netanyahu, are quick to threaten others in the region with your nuclear power. Let me be clear, all the nuclear weapons at your disposal will not rescue you. You will not survive this. And then he said, at some point, Turkish soldiers will fight in Gaza. Now, those need to be combined with what the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia said, because you're looking at two sides of the same coin. One kind is military power. The other coin is primarily economic. You have the Suez Canal. You've got the Straits of Hormuz. What does it take to shut them down and block them? Not a great deal. And then you have Iran. Iran is not like Turkey. Its population is not violently anti-Israeli. It isn't. It's very upset by what's happening. But the Iranians are much more moderate in their views. Unfortunately, though, the Iranians know that if they are to be taken seriously in the region and by the Islamic world, they have to take Gaza very seriously. And they've done that. They have an enormous arsenal of tactical theater ballistic missiles, as well as cruise missiles and unmanned systems. They have enough of them ready to shoot, ready to launch, that they could destroy much of Israel's urban terrain. In other words, its cities. We haven't even discussed the Turks yet. I'm talking about Iran. The biggest mistake we could make would be to attack Iran. And pointing to Iran and blaming them for what happens in Iraq and Syria is infantile. Those militias want us out of their countries. That's what it's about. Get out. You're not wanted. And the people that have been working to bring on a war with Iran for over a decade are saying everything they possibly can, once again, to indict Iran and provoke a war with it. I mean, remember, President Trump went through this in 2019. You had Bolton at the time and Pompeo, McKenzie and CENTCOM. All these people were, well, it's Iran, it's Iran, it's Iran. We literally set them up to shoot down the global hawk and then said, that's it. And oh, by the way, Mr. President, we have the strike packages ready to go. And President Trump said two things. First of all, how many people did we kill with the global hawk? Well, of course, none. It's unmanned. And there was no pilot. Oh, well, then what happens after we launch the strikes? What a great question. What happens if we land troops in South Vietnam? Well, we'll see what happens. We're going in. We're going to march in. We're going to do these things because it's the right thing to do. This is the problem. This is the threat to the United States. The existential threat to our country and our society is no afterthought, impulse, emotion, passion. There is no strategic reason for direct combat between ourselves and Iran. Neither is there any reason for that between ourselves and Russia or between ourselves and China. We are in other people's countries, in other people's neighborhoods, trying to dictate outcomes. That's over. We are not the great superpower of 91, and they have all recovered and become infinitely more powerful economically, militarily over the last 30 years. We need to understand that however much we want to be, we are no longer the center of the universe. We are not the sole sun in this galaxy. We don't seem to want to come to terms with that, Stephen.
Yeah.
And that's our great problem right now.
How dangerous is it for the U.S. to be spending $886 billion on defense, a number just reached this morning in the House of Representatives, a number that is more than the next 12 countries combined, including Russia, China, and Great Britain, a number that includes financing and maintaining more than 900 foreign military installations. Is it just more of the same, no matter who's in the White House?
Oh, absolutely. It's a runaway train because it enriches too many people on the Hill and inside the Beltway. And as I think President Biden pointed out and others have, it also keeps various assembly lines operating, building things, some of which are useful and some of which we don't need. But the point is that it is deeply embedded in the Washington community. And so there's not going to be any change until we are broke. I don't think that's that far off. I think Nassim Taleb and others have pointed that out. It's only a matter of time, but no one knows when the financial crisis will finally strike and put an end to it. But until the crisis comes, that's what's going to happen. Nothing will change.
Colonel, I wish you were, and maybe you will in the future, the Secretary of Defense of the United States. What would you have advised President Biden? Well, it's a weird juxtaposition. Let's say Donald Trump is elected president in 2024, and let's say you are the Secretary of Defense, and let's say he leans on you for the most serious advice about how to spend dollars on the military. Can you give us a thumbnail version of what you would tell him?
Well, a new national military strategy, something like NS-68, only updated, is badly needed. NS-68 was the document that militarized containment strategy and ultimately has brought us to where we are today. So we need a new national security strategy embodied in such a document and then ultimately ratified through legislation. But the number one consideration must be that the United States will not employ the use of military power against anyone beyond the borders of the United States unless it itself is attacked. That's number one. Number two, we are going to focus principally and primarily on Western hemispheric defense. That includes security of our borders and security of our country in a general sense, our littoral waters, and then finally re-examine all the alliance commitments. We cannot afford all of the commitments. We don't need them. The world has changed radically since most of these agreements were reached. That's the start point. And then when you move into the military itself, you've got to dramatically downsize all these regional unified commands, reducing their numbers. You've got to reduce and consolidate the so-called functional commands into a larger but smaller, in the sense of command and control setting. All of these things need to be done. And you would go from 44 four-star generals down to roughly 10 or 9. In other words, you have to size the national defense establishment in a way that is both consistent with our fiscal needs and re-examine what we call national security. Right now, national security means global military dominance by the United States and its armed forces. We really need to get out of that business. It's not necessary. In fact, it creates more trouble than it's worth.
Colonel, should we be fighting as we are in Africa and in Syria?
No. I mean, first of all, Africa, for anybody who's been there, I have, the last thing Africans need are more people with guns walking through the neighborhood. There are a lot of problems in Africa. We cannot solve them. When we intervene there to try and do so in any way, we end up looking like the French, the British, the Portuguese, the Spaniards, the Belgians, and the rest. We don't want to do that. We want to do business with everyone. We believe in a free market, but we're going to protect our markets. We're also going to protect our citizens. But we're not interested in regime change. We're not interested in imposing societal norms on people that don't want them and don't need them. We've got, all of this has to change. And so the answer to Africa is absurd. No, let's stay out of Africa as much as possible. And then Syria, no one could tell me when I was in the building what we were doing there. Sitting on a very small area with a few drilling rigs and oil wells on the assumption that this was hurting Assad. That's nonsense. It's not our territory. And we're caught right now between the Turks, the Kurds, the Iranians, all of whom are at each other's throats over territory and dominion. Why? Why should we be there doing that? In fact, the Kurds that are interested in fighting with the Turks are actually a small group. We just need to get out. We need to get out of Iraq. We still have 5,000 plus troops on the ground and 12 or 13 bases. They're all sitting targets. What are they there for? To conceal the fact that we failed in Iraq, that we were an immense strategic disaster. We've created chaos. It all needs to go away, Judge. We're not needed. We're needed at home, and the troops are needed at home on our borders.
Last question in this area. Should we stay in NATO?
I think what we should tell the Europeans is something that I actually discussed previously. And I think the president, if he ends up returning to the White House, will consider this very carefully and simply tell the Europeans, ultimately, we don't live in Europe. You do. We're happy to support you where it makes sense to do so. But ultimately, you must defend yourselves. You must be your own first responders. That's number one. Number two, a European now needs to become the supreme commander of Allied Powers Europe. In other words, we've run the show in Europe literally since 1945. Militarily, this should be done by the Europeans. How they choose to do that is their affair. And simply go back to the original underlying tenets of the NATO alliance, which was not to attack people, not to project power outside of Europe, not to start wars, but to be purely defensive. But we've got to tell the Europeans, we're getting out. We're not going to be your first responder. It doesn't make sense. And we can't rapidly reinforce the way we did in the past. We can do so with some air and naval power, but not with ground forces.
Colonel, the president has stated publicly that he wants $68 billion appropriated for Ukraine before the Congress goes home for Christmas. It does not appear as though that's going to happen, notwithstanding the full court press that the president and his people and President Zelensky waged earlier in the week. How much longer can Ukraine survive as a military entity attempting to resist the Russians as a government without United States aid?
30 days, and that's probably optimistic.
Oof.
Because as soon as it becomes clear that we're not staying, you'll see the same kind of situation unfold in Ukraine that you witnessed in Afghanistan, with all of the brave and courageous governmental leaders stashing as much cash as they can in their automobiles, in suitcases and bags, and either driving or flying out of the country. In the case of Ukraine, I'm sure you'll see the same thing. As soon as it becomes clear we're not going to supply any more cash for redistribution to the various cartel and criminal elements in Ukraine, not just the government and the army, the game's up. Everybody gets out. It's over.
I want to play a clip for you, President Zelensky with President Biden yesterday. In my opinion, what he said was shameful, but I'm anxious to hear your thoughts. Number 15, Chris.
Defending freedom. For nearly 2 years, we have been in a full-scale war, the biggest since World War II, fighting for freedom. We stand firm, no matter what Putin tries. He hasn't won any victories. Thanks to Ukraine's success in defense, other European nations are safe from the Russian aggression, unlike in the past.
Isn't there a lot of hogwash in there?
Well, of course. Think of Eastern Europe and Ukraine in particular, the way the Romans used to think about the Eastern Mediterranean. If you look at the maps of the Roman Empire, of North Africa and the Middle East, the Romans tended to restrict their interests and their interventions to the coastlines. They did not penetrate very deeply into the interior. They didn't do it because there was no benefit to doing so. There's no strategic benefit to the Russians to penetrate deeply into Ukraine, or for that matter, to threaten Eastern Europe. It's absurd. There was never any such intent. We goaded the Russians into intervening. They did. They went in with the assumption, which turned out to be false, that they could reach an agreement with the Ukrainians. Now, in defense of the position Moscow took, they, as you know, Judge, we did reach, when I say we, I'm talking about the Ukrainians and the Russians, did reach an agreement.
Right.
Which we intervened to stop and sabotage. Then we told Zelensky, you will have the total scientific, industrial, and military power of the United States and the NATO alliance. You are sure to win. And Zelensky believed him. And Zelensky was only too happy to take the billions and billions of hard cash that came flowing his way, along with all the equipment. And we know that the Ukrainians have lost roughly 500,000 dead, maybe more. And there's no bringing them back. You're talking about a generation of young men. And if you stop and think about it, this is in the space of 22 months. And in the space of 110 days during World War I, which is all that we fought for in 1918, we lost 110,000 dead. So you've got a tally of dead, roughly 5 times what we lost in 110 days over a period of 22 months. That's enough to destroy any country, especially a country the size of Ukraine, which was never the 40 million that it was supposed to be at the outset. And now it's down to what, 20 million, 19 million? Who knows? It's impossible to know, but millions have left.
I mean, Patrick Lancaster, the courageous independent journalist who lives among the ethnic Russians in the Donbas region, reported to us this morning that the Russians control about 90% of the eastern provinces, which under Russian law are part of Russia, which are clearly cultural Russians. I want to play a clip from President Putin on all this, but before I do, isn't the war effectively over, Colonel?
Well, from the standpoint of anyone who looks at this strategically, the answer is unambiguously yes. Only a fool on the Ukrainian side would try to keep it going because it's not going to get any better. The only thing that can happen from now on is that the Russians can continue to advance and ultimately seize more and more territory. And the more territory they seize, the less likely they are to give anything up. So the best shot at this point is to stop and negotiate. So the war, yeah, from a military standpoint, there's no chance of this turning around and improving under any circumstances for Ukraine.
Let's watch cut 20. Chris?
There will be peace when we achieve our goals. Now, let's get back to these goals. They don't change. Let me remind you of what we talked about the denazification of Ukraine, about demilitarization, about its neutral status. We will agree on demilitarization and agree on certain parameters. During the negotiations in Istanbul, we agreed on them, but then they simply threw these agreements into the oven. There are other possibilities, either to reach an agreement or to resolve it by force. This is what we will strive for.
President Putin earlier today, and he does this every year right before Christmas. That's 2 or 3 hour. Can you imagine Joe Biden doing this without written answers for him to read? He does this for 2 or 3 hours every Christmas time. But he's remarkably consistent, is he not?
Oh, absolutely. I would go one step further and ask you whether or not there is any leader in the Western world who, after delivering some prepared remarks for 20, 30 minutes, could then sit for almost 4 hours, answer questions, and demonstrate his command of all of the issues and the details, economic, military, political, without notes, without pausing for a second to look at anything, without turning and saying, by the way, come over here, tell me something. Impossible. The man is exceptionally intelligent, very competent, and I think from the very beginning has been straightforward and truthful. But of course, that's not what people want to say.
No. It's not what the American government wants to hear. President Zelensky still has the pipe dream of NATO membership, and he articulated that as recently as this morning. Now, Chris, I don't know which number this is, but it's President Orban of Hungary. I want you to listen. There's another solid, intelligent, rational Western leader on what they're doing in Brussels, and is it realistic that they would consider NATO membership for Ukraine?
Why we are here is not to make business. It's not about bargain. It's not about deal. We represent approaches and principles. So to give money to Ukraine is easy to do because in short term the money for Ukraine is already in the budget. So there is no any extra decision to give it in short term. In long term and the bigger sum of money, my position is that we should give it outside. But we are not under the pressure of the time because the bridging solution is already in the budget. Enlargement is not a theoretical issue. Enlargement is a merit-based, legally detailed process, which has preconditions. We have set up 7 preconditions. And even by the evaluation of the Commission, 3 out of the 7 is not fulfilled. So there is no reason to negotiate membership of Ukraine now, even not to negotiate.
That's about as clear and crisp and rationally based as it could be. I'm sure President Zelensky has a different view. I don't know what the rest of NATO thinks. What do you think?
President Orban knows the Russians. He experienced all of the various crises that occurred in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. He understands the mentality. He obviously understood what Gorbachev stood for, what he was interested in. He's visited there many times. When he speaks with this kind of understanding, and he knows that Ukraine as an entity could never be allowed to be transformed into a threat to Russia. And that is ultimately what Ukraine is all about. There is no requirement for Ukraine to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. There never was. I mean, frankly speaking, there was no requirement for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to advance into Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania.
Finland.
And now Finland, which is just stupidity on stilts, especially the Finns. But, the bottom line is that he's simply telling you the truth. Everything he said is accurate. But I like the term principles and approaches. What are our principles that justify regime change, that justify war? It doesn't make any sense. There are no such principles in the West. This is about an elite class that revolves around Washington. It is connected across Washington and London and New York City. And this elite class has decided to wage war to destroy Russia for its own reasons that have nothing to do with the interests of Europeans and the people of the Western world. There's no requirement for it. There were no armies massing to attack anyone. But remember what President Putin said. He said, we will have our requirements met. In other words, we will attain our objectives. But if for some reason we cannot, we will settle them militarily. And what I've tried to tell people from the very beginning is Ukraine is as vital and essential strategically to Russia as southern Texas, Mexico, southern Arizona, southern New Mexico, southern California would be to us.
Right.
In other words, he's not going to budge on this. And if he has to move forces all the way to the west, he's got the time. He has the forces. NATO is not growing stronger. It's dead man walking. It too is on life support. Behind the scenes, everybody's saying, now what? Now what? Now what? And if you ask them, well, it's time for you to mobilize your armed forces and march east, they all look at you as though you've lost your mind. And they're right to do so. They're not going anywhere to fight. Neither are we.
Switching gears before we close, do you sense a gap between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu over the president's ability either to justify or be indifferent about the slaughter, the absolute slaughter going on in Gaza at the hands of the Israeli Defense Forces?
I think Europeans look at President Biden and they see a living metaphor for what has happened to us as a nation. They see us as on a very steep decline. We no longer control our borders. We don't control immigration. We don't suppress criminality. The United States has become a society in free fall. We don't even know who we are. We don't have an identity. We stand by and watch as the federal government and its armed supporters and the civil populace deface monuments and tear down monuments, destroy our heritage, our culture, our history. Europeans watch this and they say, well, it looks like the Americans are finished. And at the same time, if you look at someone like Olaf Scholz, who is now wants to declare emergency conditions in Germany on the grounds that Germany has to be ready to fight Russia, which is, of course, laughable. In reality, he's trying to prepare his regime to suppress opposition to it inside Germany. That is appalling, but that's where he's headed. I wouldn't be surprised if Mr. Macron doesn't end up in the same position. All of these governments in the West are going to be swept away. They're finished. They're done. Their populations have had it with them. They are going to be replaced, but they're not going to be replaced by the people or people like the individuals that are currently governing Western Europe or this country.
All right. Before Joe Biden is replaced, what do you think will happen if Netanyahu asks him for American ground troops in Gaza?
Well, I think if
or in the West Bank, which I think would be more likely the request.
I don't know about that. I think the Israelis can cope with the West Bank as well as Gaza. The area where they're going to have more difficulty is the northern front facing Hezbollah. I mean, if you look at Hezbollah, its capabilities, the forces it can field, it makes Hamas look like a volunteer fire department.
But it is not an American national security interest. It may be an American domestic political interest, but not national security interest to put troops there, American troops.
No, but bear in mind that if this widens, if this escalates, and I've expressed my view in the past that I fear escalation. I don't see how we avoid it. I don't see how this does not eventually engulf the entire region. The request for U.S. troops will come at a point in time where the purpose is to rescue Israel. And I'm not sure that when that comes, we'll be able to do it. Because, again, we're not the great military power of 1990 and 91. We're a shadow of our former selves. And more important, the American electorate has changed. Our population demographically has changed. You can't rely on it to come to Israel's aid under those circumstances. That's why I think privately, Biden, Sullivan, Blinken, all of whom have been told to shut up and go home, have tried to say, look, this can't go on. But from Mr. Netanyahu's standpoint, he's in control of Congress, and he has the upper hand inside the White House itself, I suspect. And I would not be at all surprised if this does not go on all the way into the next year in Gaza. The question is, as this begins to wind down in Gaza and there's nothing left and almost nobody left to live there, what happens in the rest of the region? And that's something that I think is going to surprise everyone, just as much as the Israelis were surprised by what happened on 7 October. And that, notwithstanding the questions about how that happened to begin with, and I myself continue to wonder about that. But nevertheless, that notwithstanding, what happens then? Because we've talked about it before, the situation in Turkey, the situation in Iran, the situation everywhere is bad. And then you have this very dangerous element in Washington that's decided that the solution to all of our troubles is to strike Iran. That going to war with Iran will solve the problems in the Middle East and help us. Well, they must be responding to donors, because I see no evidence for that argument whatsoever. That would be catastrophic for us. And remember, the Chinese have very serious interests in the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula, access to the Red Sea, access to the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, not for the purpose of attacking us or challenging us. That's all nonsense. They are desperately dependent upon food, oil, and gas that come from those regions, especially from Africa when it comes to food. Are they going to sit by and watch Iran destroyed when they depend so heavily on it? And what does Russia do? Russia now has probably the most experienced and capable military force in the world. What are they going to do? Are they going to stand by and watch us pulverize Iran into rubble? I don't think so. So I don't see how this helps us, but that seems to be the undercurrent inside the Beltway. Well, we know how to solve the problem in Gaza. Go to war with Iran. Insane.
Why do they hate Iran and why do they hate Putin? Is it just because they want to feed their masters in the military-industrial complex, unlike George Orwell's 1984? Remember Emmanuel Goldstein? Yeah. Everybody hated him. Turned out he didn't exist. He was just somebody that the government created to be an object of their hatred.
That's right. Well, look, I think you're asking a difficult question for which there's not an easy answer. There are a lot of donors out there with lots of agendas, and the donors have money. They can outperform anybody else. And when you're living in that environment, this idea of principles and approaches that we heard from Mr. Orban, which I think is a very good statement, suddenly is meaningless in Washington. And remember, Washington is a planet. It's not part of the rest of us. I don't know how many times I've tried to talk to people in Washington inside the Beltway, particularly members of the House, to a lesser extent the Senate. There are a few that understand, but not very many. Life out there is not very good right now. The situation is very, very bad. And they say, oh, yes, of course, but we're confident we can cope with that. Well, if you live in a gated community, you live in Great Falls or McLean, if you're remote from reality, yeah, I suppose you can manage everything.
Colonel, we have begun taking an informal, unscientific poll. Any of our viewers can weigh in. And the question we asked today was, how much longer do you think the war would go on in Gaza? 1 month, 3 months, 3 to 6 months, more than 6 months. 47%, almost half, more than 6 months. Surprised?
No, I think Americans in particular, although admittedly you have an audience overseas too, Judge.
Yes.
But Americans are beginning to wise up. Look at the numbers of Americans that say, wait a minute, I support Israel. I want Israel to survive. But why aren't we closing the border? Where are all the troops to protect us along our southern border? What's happened to the police? All the police are retiring. Nobody wants to be a policeman because the police are in greater fear of going to jail than if they do their jobs. I mean, this is incomprehensible. I mean, you and I know I did, grew up in a world where we respected police.
Yes.
I mean, we did. And in many cases, we knew them. We didn't know them all, but we knew a lot of them, and we weren't afraid of them. All of that is gone now because the police itself has no power and authority. It lives in fear of the attorney general or whoever he happens to be in that respective precinct or district or city. It's catastrophic. So why are you spending all of this money for everything else other than what's really important here? And oh, by the way, the bridges in my neighborhood are crumbling and are probably going to fall apart.